Hello, welcome to the video. Today I'm working on this 2004 Suzuki Carry K-truck. It's a four-wheel drive DA63T model code and it needs a new clutch, or at least I think it needs a new clutch. Why do I think that? Well, it's quite tricky to get it into gear, particularly first gear from standstill. When you're driving, the gear shift feels a little bit crunchy, if you know what I mean. If you've experienced similar symptoms before, I'm sure you will know what I mean. When the engine's off and you put your foot on the clutch, it shifts into gear really easily. So I don't think it's a problem with the shift linkages, etc. So the first thing I went for when I noticed this symptom was the clutch cable. I've adjusted it, tightened it up, that is, as much as I can. So I've taken all the slack out of it basically, which is not how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to have a little bit of slack in, but anyway, just for the purposes of testing, and it's made absolutely no difference. So the other thing I've noticed is that when the truck is on flat ground with handbrake off, foot off the brake, and you try and put it into gear, it actually starts, it feels like it wants to move forward, and indeed it does move forward a little bit. Now, I've not done that very much because that's not a very kind thing to do to a gearbox, so I'm not going to do it in the video today to demonstrate it, but it moves forward. And that tells me that the drive isn't being disengaged from the engine to the gearbox, and so that points fairly and squarely at the clutch, doesn't it? So I have bought a new clutch kit. I've got that from Japan, got it sent over, and I'm going to fit it today. Maybe you can tell, maybe you can't. Anyway, I've raised the truck up on some wooden blocks so I can get underneath with my crawler on wheels, just to make it a bit easier to do. Also so I can get the transmission jack under there. This truck's done about 35,000 miles and it's a 2004 model year. So with that mileage, I wouldn't really expect to be changing a clutch. When I've needed to do a change of clutch before, it's been much higher mileage than that. However, we have no idea about how it's been driven. It might have been driven by someone who likes to rest their foot on the clutch when they're driving, for example. You just don't know. Or there may have been some sort of premature component failure, perhaps in the release bearing or something like that. So who knows? We'll find out, hopefully. Hi, I'm back in different clothes, adding this bit during the editing process. So as I've been editing this video, putting it all together, it struck me that there isn't as much detail in this video as you'll be used to seeing in most of my other videos, and as I usually like to provide. So I'm really sorry about that. Sometimes I only have a set amount of time to do the jobs that I'm recording for these videos, and as you're probably aware if you've tried making a video of something yourself, videoing a job makes it take easily twice as long as it otherwise would. And time got the better of me with this one, so that's why there isn't quite as much detail as I would like there to be. So as I said, sorry about that. I've decided to go ahead and publish the video anyway, in the hope that there is still enough information in here to give you the confidence to crack on and tackle this job yourself if you wish to. Now, having said that, if there's anything that you feel I really haven't explained well enough at all or isn't clear, please do ask in the comments and I will do my best to answer. You've probably noticed, I hope you've noticed anyway, that I answer the vast majority of comments. Occasionally people comment with things like telling me off for wearing gloves or something like that, and I don't bother answering those. But if you've got a question on doing this job and you want it answered by someone who's done this job, then please do put it in the comments and I will do my best to respond. Okay, that's it for this little interlude. Let's get back to the main content. So I think the starter motor is going to have to come off, so disconnect the battery first of all. Tucks around there, out of the way. And as is good practice, I'm going to take the fill plug out first, or at least make sure I can loosen it first, which I can. otherwise we've got a gearbox with no oil in and no way of filling it. No, that's a real shame now I've done that, because that looks super clean to me. Never mind. We can tell which is the fill and which is the drain because one's got a magnet on and the other hasn't. Let's have a closer look at those. So fill plug, super clean, drain plug, magnet, little bit of gloop on there, not too bad I would say. There we go. I'm going to refit these loosely once the oil has drained, just to stop any muck getting in there. If you're wondering why I'm not using power tools on these, I don't have a manual for this vehicle, and I've not worked on one before, not done a clutch on one before anyway. So doing things by hand, in my view anyway, is a good way to learn how tight they were, so you can put them back in a similar way, or to a similar tightness I should say. After disconnecting the prop shaft from the differential, you will see me tying it up for the moment to the body of the truck. Now it's perfectly possible to just pull it out of the back of the transmission as you would with a lot of other prop shafts and store it separately. I'm not doing that. I'm going to remove this prop shaft with the gearbox. I know that's making life harder for myself, but I'm doing everything I can to preserve the oil seal at the back of the gearbox, because if I damage it and I need to get a new one, then I will have to wait and order that from Japan, and that will introduce a delay that I don't really want. Now we move on to the front prop shaft then. I'm recording this audio afterwards. The wind noise on this bit of video was more than I wanted really, so in case you're wondering why I sound a little bit different, that's why. So again, we're carrying on with the 12mm socket that I used for the rear prop shaft. You'll notice I'm using a screwdriver through the universal joint there just to hold it in place because it's not in four-wheel drive, so this one can spin freely. We're undoing it at the transfer box end of the front prop shaft in case that isn't obvious. And these ones weren't particularly tight as for the rear. So once it's undone, it's just a case of giving it a gentle bit of encouragement with the rubber or plastic faced hammer and then tying it up out of the way. Whilst we're in this area then, it makes sense to move on to the starter motor next, starting with the small spade connector for the solenoid trigger, and then after that moving on to the main positive lead. You remember I disconnected the battery already at the start of the video, so this was just a 12mm nut. And then after that I moved on to removing the starter itself, and this is also 12mm, so 2 bolts as you can see in the video. It's really lovely to find a vehicle where there isn't a cheeky third bolt hidden round the back somewhere that's really hard to get to. I can think of plenty of instances where that's happened to me, so thank you Suzuki for not being one of those manufacturers. And with those two off, the starter motor can be removed. Okay, let's keep going on the electrics theme now. Ah, it's nice, they're different sizes, so they'll be easy to remember, or easy to get right I should say, to put back on. I'm going to undo this bracket rather than trying to wrestle with the connector, because it'd probably be quicker, well, not the connector, the clip. So we've got another electrical connection just up there on the top of the gearbox. I'm approaching from the passenger side. Okay, let's look at the control cables next then. So we are at the back of the gearbox here. Obviously there's the rear prop shaft. Got one going to the transfer box there. And we've got one there and another one behind it. So one with a green tag on, that goes to the outside, and then behind that there's the other one. These two have those metal spring clips, and then a little pin like that where you need to lift up one side and then slide it out. So the one on the transfer case looks to have a plastic tab on it, so I shall be suitably careful with that one, or at least I'll try to be. Having disconnected the ends of the cables from the shift levers on the gearbox, then the next thing to do was to disconnect these brackets that you see me working on now. I hadn't encountered clips like this before, and this was quite a protracted battle which took much longer than it really should have done. So I tried a variety of different things. It wasn't immediately clear whether the cable needed to come out of the clip or whether the clip and the cable needed to come off together. It turns out that the latter was true. So what you see here in fast forward is me trying a number of different approaches to try and get this cable out. At one stage I came to the conclusion that it would actually have been quicker just to unbolt all of the black bracketry that you see there from the gearbox itself and leave all of that on the truck. But I realised the bolts holding those brackets in place actually went through the two halves of the gearbox casing. So in the end I decided that that wasn't such a good idea. So I went back to the clips again, and finally, after a painfully long amount of time, I worked out how to do it. So basically there are two little tabs here and here which need to be pushed back that way, and then they can release from these two indentations here, and then the whole thing can slide out. It's not purely under spring tension as I initially expected it to be. So I'm going to go and do the same with the other one now I've learnt how to do this one. Okay, a little update for you. We're on the right hand side, the driver's side of the vehicle now, looking back towards the centre. That other control cable has come off. Once I've done the first one, the second one was a lot easier. And then the four-wheel drive selector, I presume it is, cable came off quite easily. That was, as I suspected, or as I said earlier, just that plastic tab locating in that slot there, and then that could slide out. Taken so this bracket was also, it shared the same bolt with that, and it was a bolt that went right into the gearbox, which I didn't particularly like taking out, but short of I suppose taking it off up there seemed like the easiest way to do it. So we can see the clutch in there. This is the cover for the clutch cable. If we come back here, you'll see I've backed that off all the way, and if I can do this whilst holding the torch, that enables that to just pull, and that's the clutch cable disconnected, and then it will just pull out, well, either now actually, or as we take the gearbox off. I'm tempted to take it out now if I can. There we go. Okay, all the bell housing bolts are out. They're mostly bolts, but there's two studs which are going to be really useful for guiding the gearbox back in afterwards. It's almost like it was designed with a mechanic in mind. As far as I can tell, I have disconnected everything from the gearbox. That mounting bolt up there is loose. What I mean by that is it's still in place holding the gearbox in, but the nut isn't on the other side, and if I can lift the gearbox up with my hand actually and push it out. So I'm going to get the transmission jack under here now, and then we should be able to get ourselves the gearbox out. Clearly I'm making this bit of video after I've taken the gearbox out of the truck, but I put it in here because it's going to be most relevant for you. So I originally thought I could take the bolt out here and that would allow the box to slide back without undoing it here, but actually that wasn't the case. So we got to a situation where it wasn't quite off the studs at the front, but this was catching against the back of the chassis point that it bolts to. So instead of unbolting it there, I recommend you undo these 3 bolts here, leave that hanging and take the rest of the gearbox off separately. So there we go, gearbox is out. I made life unnecessarily hard for myself by not having the vehicle high enough up. So the box couldn't stay on the transmission jack because it couldn't come out from under the car, so I had to sort of manhandle it onto these dollies. Anyway, it's out. As always, the main challenge with this is that the transfer wants to make everything rotate, and so it's quite a sort of an awkward weight distribution to handle. But it's out. I'm going to take the clutch out now, and then we'll address the release bearing. Okay, let's have a look at the release bearing. Sounds a little bit noisy. You can see quite a lot of grease here. I think the release bearing has seen better days. It still feels smooth, but it sounds dry. There's not so much in the way of play in it. Okay, do I need to pay attention to which way that goes back? Probably not. Looks quite symmetrical. There's a very good document from, I never know whether to say Luck or Luke, anyway, big manufacturer of clutches. They didn't make this one, but a very good document on diagnosis of clutch failure, and it sort of helped my thought process about what might have been going on. So I'll put a link to that in the description. Anyway, we can see here these fingers are worn. Some of them have got a ridge in them that you can actually feel, some worse than others. That's the first point. Turning it over, we've got these areas, although it feels completely smooth, we've got these areas particularly towards the centre where it seems to have been rubbing more than others, maybe, I don't know. So there's kind of a line as well, about 1 centimetre on the inner edge there, that you can make out. Feels quite smooth though, and we can see actually some rough areas, particularly there and there. I don't know whether that's contamination or whether that's the surface starting to break up. Moving on to the release bearing. The release bearing has completely let go of all of its grease. When I first saw this, I was concerned that the gearbox oil seal had a leak, but it didn't. That was completely dry. So the release bearing has lost its grease, and you can tell it's dry. If I give it a spin, hopefully you'll hear it. Doesn't feel to be too much play in there, and it doesn't feel notchy when spinning it, but it looks a little bit worn, and it sounds very dry. So I think there isn't one clear catastrophic failure here, but I think just several things adding together have meant that the clutch was no longer doing its job, no longer releasing properly, and that's what was causing the problem with the truck not going into first gear. Okay, there's the new bearing in place. Everything's cleaned up, as hopefully you can tell. And put some molybdenum paste on these surfaces, obviously on the other side, so that the bearing can articulate against those nice and smoothly. I'll be putting some in there as well when I go to refit everything. In fact, I might just give that a little clean with a wire brush as well, because there's a little bit of pitting in there. Okay, so I've cleaned that, cleaned the input shaft really well. And having done that, I'm going to put a little bit of molybdenum paste on the splines. And having done that, I'll take the new clutch disc, make sure it slides smoothly on the splines, and then I can clean up any excess that it's cleaned off in the course of being slid up and down there, so that we don't have loads of it flinging around when the clutch is spinning. Now, I've done this in the wrong order.
that's nice and clean. Tiny bit of this on here. Might look like a lot, but it is a tiny bit, I assure you. Put a bit inside there as well. Check that can slide smoothly, which it can. Now we just need to hoik this little spring back onto here. It's moving really nice and freely, just as it should. Here we are underneath then. So there's a whole load of dust around here that I just want to clean off. I'm going to clean the mounting pins as well, just to make sure the new clutch slides on there nice and easily. I've checked the pilot bearing already. Sorry about these shadows, the various control cables are in the way of my light. I've checked the pilot bearing already, that's fine. So just going to clean everything up and probably use some brake cleaner just to make sure there's no grease left, and then we'll be ready to reinstall. I'm not going to show the cleaning because I will have a mask on and there'll be dust everywhere, so yeah, I'll come back after I've done that. Just preparing the clutch for installation then, so given this surface a good clean. That's what came off just on the first pass, so well worth doing. And then I'm going to get it set up with my clutch alignment tool, which only just fits in this clutch because it's such a small clutch, and we'll get it installed. There we go then, one new clutch. So cleaned the flywheel as we talked about before, cleaned the locating pins, there's 3 of them. Then set the clutch up with the clutch alignment tool. As I was editing the video, I realised that I didn't really video or explain the clutch alignment process very thoroughly. At least I felt I didn't. Anyway, when I was helping my dad work on cars as a child and this clutch alignment tool came out, I had not got a clue what it did, and I felt really frustrated that I didn't kind of get why it was needed. So I thought I would go through it with the old clutch to show you what's involved. We'll come to that tool in a minute. So when we are bolting this back onto the flywheel, we need to have this sandwiched between this and the flywheel. And when these bolts are tight, the spring tension means that this is held tightly between this and the flywheel, so you can't move it. So if you've bolted those 2 things back, the next thing to do is to come and put the gearbox back into place. And if you're wrestling, I've set it up in an extreme example here, but if you're wrestling the gearbox back into place and you're trying to get the input shaft of the gearbox into there, and this isn't central, then you're not going to do it, because this is fixed in position and you can't move the gearbox obviously, because it has to line up with the bolt holes that it's got with the engine. So this tool is to enable you to get this centered on this, and if I turn it over you'll see it more clearly. So get this exactly in the center like that and hold it there while you're bolting it up. So this tool comes with 3 different sizes of attachment. This one, as we tighten this, it pulls this out like that and it wedges it into there, which is where the input shaft of the gearbox goes into. So we need this nice and slack to start with. Put that through there like that. Now this one only just fits I'll screw that back out so it's back to the start. So the first stage is to tighten this up until that piece of metal is starting to expand that section like that, and we want it to be wedged just in there like that. So it's gradually pulling in, and that's quite tight now. Then I'm going to screw this section in so that it pulls into these spring fingers here and holds everything exactly central. So as that's turning the whole thing, hold that and tighten that down. You can hear the metal contact now, so that's tight now. So then we can do a final check that it's in the middle. It should kind of pull it into the middle anyway, but sometimes it doesn't quite get it right. There we go. So that's tightened now. This is conical, as you can see, so it's pulled the tool into the centre of all of these. That friction disc is completely central and you can't move it. So at this point you would install the clutch, and I've talked about that in the video, and then it's time to take the tool out. So all you would really need to do in most cases is back that off completely. Remember that you can't get to the back of it anymore, so you need to push the metal rod back through so it's not expanding that cone at all. And it just did expand that cone when I did that. So I think for this one it's actually simplest to disassemble it all together, so you can hold this rod in so it's not expanding that cone, and then pull the whole thing back through. Here ends my explanation of how to use a clutch alignment tool. I hope it was useful. Let's carry on with the rest of the video.
Then I put the new clutch on. There's 6 bolts. They've got spring washers on them. The spring washers didn't look in the finest of fettle, but they're kind of captive onto the bolts and didn't have any new bolts, so I decided to use a little bit of blue thread lock, medium strength thread lock on there as well. Screwed them all up hand tight, then tighten them quarter of a turn at a time in a crisscross pattern until the clutch plate was touching the flywheel, and then I torqued them up. I couldn't find any torque specs for this, but I torqued them up to 20 Newton meters because that seemed about right to me. So we are ready for wrestling the gearbox back into position now.
Good news then, there's a gearbox back in place. I've cleaned all the selector pins where the cables mount. I'm going to put the clutch cable back in, then the 4-wheel drive selector, and then the 2 gear selectors on the other side. Put the cables back on, reconnect the front and rear prop shafts, and then we'll be ready to see how it feels. In fact, what I'll do before I do anything more, I will do the clutch cable first, and then we'll see how the pedal feels before I start putting everything back together. That would be a better way round, wouldn't it? Put that mark there because that's the point where on the fork where the release bearing makes contact, so I guess we should have some slack back from that, shouldn't we, so that it's not held permanently in contact. So that feels about right to me. I mean, we'll have to see how it goes when I'm driving it, but that feels about okay, and it doesn't feel like there's too much play at the pedal, so I'm going to go with that. I'll put all the other bits and pieces back and then let you know how it all went. Everything's back together then. All the cables connected, all the electrical connectors are connected, the front and rear prop shafts are connected, and now we're filling up with gear oil. And my preferred method of doing this is to allow gravity to do it. So we've got the tube going down, under and into the fill plug, and I'm gradually just topping it up. I'll just show you the oil I'm using, some Castrol Transmax 75W9T GL4. So as a final word, I thought I'd share Isin's own advice to ensure a perfect job. Handle with care and cleanliness. Check for smooth sliding of disc on transmission input shaft and remove any dirt and excessive grease. We've done that. Clean surfaces of pressure plate and flywheel. Done that. Avoid misalignments. Done that. Tighten bolts diagonally. Done that as well. Great stuff.
Alright, the Suzuki's all back together, it's back on the ground, and most importantly I've taken it for a little drive and it's fixed. It's great news. I love doing clutches because if you've got your diagnosis right, when you drive it after you've done the clutch, it just transforms the whole experience. So the bite point is much lower, as you'd expect, because we've fitted a new clutch. The clutch action is much smoother, and it also feels lighter, which is quite a surprise because it felt pretty light beforehand, but it's even lighter now. That bit of slack in the clutch cable that I was telling you about earlier, that seems pretty much spot on in terms of the clutch releasing fully when the pedal's pressed all the way down to the stop. The most important thing, of course, is that it goes into first gear from a standstill straight away, no messing about. And that is the whole that was the whole reason for doing this in the first place. So that brings this video to a close. Thanks very much for joining me. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it or found it useful, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I look forward to seeing you for the next one. Thanks very much. Bye for now.